One fine morning in 1957, beautiful sunny day, Fred Herzog perched himself on the Burrard Bridge and took a picture of Vancouver's first suburb, the West End.
This got taped or recorded, all of everything you guys said, because I didn't understand the words. So has it been recorded?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure I'll
Because I thought it was very good, and I'd like to hear it. Today, when I have regained my hearing, I would like to listen to all these comments and it would be a real loss if I never heard it. Or maybe my wife, who has a good memory, can tell me when we drive home.
Nobody ever goes away in this town. You should know that. Yeah. It's my theory, is the blue box theory. None of us ever goes away. We're just recycled.
Please join me in welcoming Andy Sylvester.
Thank you very much. And before I start, I just would like to thank several people who I saw in the audience when I walked in, who have a very important role both in Fred's development as a photographer, but also in photography and in art in Vancouver. Curators in institutions are people who rarely get patted on the back. So I'd first and foremost like to thank Grant Arnold, who did the most important show of Fred's work to date in 2007 at the Vancouver Art Gallery. I think I see Helga Pakasar, Diane Evans from Presentation House, Bill Jeffries and Stephen Waddell, all people who have been really important in the development, not only in helping Fred Herzog, but in helping photography in the city. And in terms of helping me, I see my wonderful staff, two of them at least, Sophie and Deirdre, and I think Ron may be here too, and without them, I wouldn't be standing. So I'm going to take my 5 minutes of allotted time to take a quick view through an important vein in the history of photography, which includes Fred Herzog. And that is the medium's inherent ability to describe in two-dimensional space what is in front of it. Essentially the recording of fact, and in postmodern times you have to put quotation marks around fact. It is an honorable and very sophisticated part of the history of photography, and I think it's important to understanding Fred's work. There are many different terms that have been used throughout history to describe, and it's a continuing tradition, that have been used to describe this part of photography. Documentary, descriptive, vernacular. John Sarkowski called it the new document, and Fred likes to call it photorealism. Regardless of its title, and they all sort of make some sense, this tradition encompasses many great photographers who use their own personal experience and really a visual intuition to create a substantial bodies of work. So I've chosen 3 photographs tonight. Basically, the press conference is German photographer takes pictures of America. And I thought, that's actually quite accurate in a strange and odd way. If we add an S to America, and we think about the Americas, and we think about this new world that Fred came to in the 1950s. What's interesting for me about this picture is that it's a picture of duality. Everything in this picture seems to have a double. there are two menus. There's a Chinese menu and what might be called a Western menu. There are spelling mistakes in the menu on the right, except the spelling mistakes are in English, and I suspect the proprietor, that's not their first language. The meal tickets are a subsidized public program, but the entrepreneur of the restaurant has decided to give a special bonus that you get a special credit for them. So that duality exists again. And of course, Santa Claus, which is in all three pictures. Again, a Coke intervention, but in this case, in sort of Vancouver classic, Pepsi's been collaged over the front of it in a mid-century kind of art world thing. And Santa Claus, the two Santa Clauses border the most pathetic Christmas tree I've ever seen. And of course, the other duality of the picture is the Paris Cafe is not really in Paris. It's here. But what for me is most compelling about this photograph is the gaze of the subject to the photographer. And if you can see just to the left shoulder of the fellow, you see Fred. So the relationship of the photographer and the subject in this particular case is quintessentially photographic. It is a moment that exists between a photographer and a subject that can only take place for a very short period of time and requires great sophistication, great emotional status, and great brilliance in order to make it work. So Fred has this in many of his pictures, and I was thinking about what it is, and I think it's more than empathy. I think it's a kind of existential empathy where he has as much in that fellow's brain as that fellow is when he looks out into the world. The way that white wood and the green sticks there, these are not accidents. His ability to frame, his ability to choose, his ability to edit is spectacular.
And Fred likes to remind me that the first time we crossed paths was in the 1970s when we did a book that probably nobody will remember.
They asked me to find one picture that I wanted to speak about. And growing up here in Vancouver, and especially in the last years, become familiar with a lot of your photography. And I was going through the Equinox Gallery, going through the images, and suddenly this one came up. And I thought, good gosh, like the only thing that's missing is a big flock of bats coming over. We certainly have a love-hate relationship with cars. They're either alternately bright pink or rusted, and they seem to be ornaments and pollution. I look at this image here. I mean, what was it about that building that made them say, no, we better put the word hotel on it? It is absolutely filthy, and it's disgusting, and yet it's beautiful. The camera loves dirt. The camera likes the sort of the unusual, the atypical. I have dreams at night where I'm just back in time, not too far, maybe just 3 or 4 decades. I'm still able to see the dirt. I'm still able to see the grime. You've done a great service to the city and to history by recording sort of truthfulness in everything you did. And I thank you for that. And also, I like the way you always have a hit of red in each one of your photographs. And I feel like a baby seagull looking at the moment, like wanting to touch that little red spot on the beak.
Thank you very much indeed. I am such a big fan of Fred's photography. I am absolutely thrilled to be here tonight to talk about this particular image. It was in Susan Sontag's book on photography that I was introduced to the idea that photography had become a proxy for experience, a substitute for lived experience. That by framing and capturing a time and place for later reference, the person with the camera was foregoing genuine active participation in that time and place. My father was an amateur photographer. He had a Nikon and a Rolleiflex, and I well remember the ritual of sending Kodachrome off to be developed in the little envelope that came with the film, and eventually getting back in the mail those little plastic boxes of slides that snapped open, slotting them into a carousel projector, realizing that that one was flopped and that one was upside down, sticking them back in the projector, and eventually sitting in the dark, as these saturated images played upon the white wall.
The next presenter is Sam Sullivan. He's the founder and CEO of the Global Civil Policy Society, but you probably know him as the former mayor of Vancouver, and he's also a very, very good friend. Please welcome Sam Sullivan.
Thank you, Rudy, and thank you, Fred. One fine morning in 1957, beautiful sunny day, Fred Herzog perched himself on the Burrard Bridge and took a picture of Vancouver's first suburb, the West End. Did he sense the revolutionary changes that were about to engulf this neighborhood? It was like taking a picture of a bomb just before it explodes, or maybe a cocoon about to reveal some fantastical metamorphosis. From the outside, there was no way to tell what forces were bubbling under the surface of the houses. The suburban city was groaning under the pressure of the growing population. The city's financial elite had largely decamped to Shaughnessy, and the houses were being divided for growing numbers of renters. The West End would be the place where the buildings would break through the old model and bring something unknown and new. Within 15 years, 250 residential towers would push aside these homes and shoot for the sky, providing housing and community for the refugees of the old model, the elderly, the gay, office workers, transient. Old Vancouver considered it an affront, a rabbit's warren, they said. Placard-waving, idealistic university students would protest it. Urban planners detested it. Twice they would mount organized attacks against the zoning that allowed it. It was unplanned, it was organic, it was gritty. 15 years after this picture was taken, a wave of urban reform sweeping the continent would prevail in the West End and would be frozen in time. Change would slow to a trickle. Politicians and planners would say, never again. Growth would be redirected to the suburbs. Downzonings would spread throughout the city. The tight restrictions on supply of housing would lead to the steady rise of prices. Outraged commuters driving over the bridge would initiate the view corridors that would allow them to look directly through the city and see a mountain. To gaze at this remarkable picture, to see the last moment of an unsuspecting city about to be wrenched into a new world, to see a simpler life about to get really complicated. Less than 100 years earlier, these houses had replaced 300-foot-tall old-growth forests. In seeking some rationale for imposing height limits on buildings, city officials poetically set them at the ancient forest canopy.
On her way here, she'd made it, she was in Toronto, had made it to the airport, and just as she was to come here, she had an urgent family matter and had to fly to Nanaimo again at the last minute and couldn't be here in person. But being the superb radio host that she is on CBC Radio, and in her spirit of the show must go on, she has taped her essay. She rushed into her studio, taped it, and sent us an MP3 file because she really wanted to be here and really wanted to be part of it. Sheila Rogers, of course, is also the host of our on-air pledge campaign. So, in her own words, as a radio host would, we'll hear her voice. And are we ready? If we could roll Sheila Rogers.
There they are again. Same bat time, same bat corner. Come to think of it, same old bats. As always, they're dressed in their best. the gloves, the beads, the scarves, because right after they've done their shift, they're going to go into that big house down the street, the one with no windows. I don't know what they do in there, but they always leave, those women, with stacks of awake clasped to their chests to hand out to passers-by. And you never know, one of these days, they might get a bite. The tall one in the nubbly blue coat reminds me of my grandmother. She came from a rural Ontario town called Stroud. She was a Methodist. She was to cleanliness what Captain Von Trapp was to discipline. She ironed her sheets and her shoelaces. She got dressed up to go to the bathroom. You'd never see her without her pearls and a pin. After my grandfather died, she lived alone for many years. Her life revolved around the church. Her name was Dorothy, and she even looked like that tall one there on the left. So let's call her Dorothy, okay? And then there's the friend of Dorothy. Oh, I once met a male acquaintance of my grandmother's, by the way, walking his dog in a park. I went up to him and said, "I hear you are a friend of Dorothy." He asked me how I knew, and I said, "Well, she was my grandmother. She used to talk about you." And then he told me if you were a friend of Dorothy, that used to mean you were gay. Anyway, I think Dorothy's friend here on the right looks like a tough old bird. She could have played Ma Jode in The Grapes of Wrath, but I'm pretty sure Ma Jode went off to California without a handbag. Dorothy's friend wouldn't go anywhere without her handbag. I see these ladies, and they don't see me. I'm looking right at them, but they're both looking in other directions. I might be able to escape. I've been drawn into religious groups before. Right after a car accident when I was 17, I became a born again, but I've since died again. So seeing the ladies, and they are ladies, triggers an inner alarm. However, I can't take my eyes off them, and I want to know their story. I see them and I think they are part of a vanishing breed. It's 1966, and their foundations will shift tectonically in a year from now with a swinging prime minister, Expo 67, and hippies who will find salvation some other way. But that's down the road. Right now, they've got a job to do, a quota to meet. And here they are, the old reliables in the bright spring sunshine. They are exactly where they are supposed to be, stopping you and stopping me, and thrusting a copy of the Watchtower into our reluctant hands. As my eyes leave their faces, I scan down and observe the label on the City of Vancouver trash bin. You know, Fred Herzog could have called this photograph waste paper, but he didn't. He dignified the lives of these two women by calling it awake, and I love him for that. Thank you, Fred.
So, well, this picture, what stood out to me, that the fellow on the left who's looking back, he recognized me because I used to go to movies, and he worked at one of the movie theaters as an usher, and it might have been one of the two big ones, the Vogue or the Capitol, whatever they were called. And he recognized me, and he sort of thought, "What are you doing here with the camera in the rain?" But anyway, that what made me take the picture, that I did get the pink emblem on top, in addition to the pink umbrella. I have to admit, that's sheer accident. You know, good pictures are not always thoughtfully constructed. You're there, you press the button at the right time, or maybe the wrong time, but that's your chance. And in those days, we didn't go rat-tat-tat-tat like people do now with the electronic digital cameras. Take 20 pictures in a row and throw 19 away. And there's no loss because it just erases them from the record. Again, I don't know what Doug Coupland said about that picture. I would have loved to hear it. And he may have said something. I have no idea what he said, but I can imagine that he thought, this is not exactly supreme architecture. There's something missing here. And for me, it was absolutely, my cup ran over. I saw this and I knew that I had a picture I really, really want to have. And I did something I almost never do. I took 3 pictures of that. And I don't know what happened to the other 2, but just for safety, I took 3 pictures. Because they were handheld with a telephoto lens. And you can jiggle it quite easily, especially when you stand on a bridge where there's lots of traffic. How I got it sharp, I have no idea, because those were just not the days of high-speed film. We're on to the next picture now. Those 2 fellows, to me, they remind me of a little bit painfully of childhood, my own. I think unconsciously at that age we are in a way mimicking adults, and there's a certain I think unconscious desire to look like an adult and to do things just right, and so they did. But I like that picture very much because it has a certain amount of memories and emotion in it. Next is that I still should be talking now, shouldn't I? Until the next picture comes up. Oh yeah, that's one of my favorites. And what I really liked is that Andy had 2 black and white pictures, also with Santa Clauses in it. How did he find those? I have no idea. I did like the menu there, and I never had the nerve to go in there and eat from that menu. It didn't quite. I didn't have high standards then, but I didn't have those standards either. I think the main attraction to me were the Santa Clauses, and of course the exotic name Paris Cafe. If you read Paris Cafe on a place, you somehow think of something fairly upscale. And this kind of lacked that, and that made it very attractive to me. New things don't take good pictures. New things don't look right on film. You have to find something that has the traces of usage on them. People going in and out, menus that get rewritten every 2 years. As prices went down, not up. The fellow stands there, I don't know him, and he didn't seem to take notice of me at all, and I'm grateful for that because it makes the picture very authentic. This picture of the West End is similar to another picture of the West End I took, and for the other picture I went back in 2003 and re-photographed it. And where you see the mountains here, they were just in 2003, just tall buildings and you could not at all see the mountains. I tried to reshoot this picture with the mountains blocked out by tall buildings, but it wasn't possible because there are now massive gray, huge buildings right by Burrard Bridge, and you cannot take that picture anymore. So this is why I did not repeat that picture. The other one was taken from Granville Bridge with a probably slightly longer lens. It shows that contrast incredibly. It has been actually used in a book. I used to live in Harlow, Harwood Street. That's the second street in. This is Pacific Street, and the next street is Harwood Street. and I lived at 1040 Harwood Street. In those days I had a motorcycle, and there was a German friend living next door, not exactly a friend, maybe an acquaintance, but I saw him walk in the street with a backpack full of bricks. And I said, hey, what are you doing? And he says, I'm practicing for my trip to Galapagos. I have to take everything with me. And he opened up a piece of newspaper, and in it were big pliers for pulling out teeth. He kind of thought he'd go to Galapagos and stay there. And he'd need this tool to remove his bad teeth. That was very good foresight. And well, he never did get to Galapagos. He never even left. But he was in good shape by that time. And I had another friend there who had the same motorcycle I had, and we often rode out, and he may still live in town. I don't know where he is. I've not seen him in years. Here we have the two ladies. I didn't hear what Sheila Rogers said. I would have loved to hear that, and I hope that is all on tape so I can hear it sometime, because I heard lots of applause and laughing. I think I did hear that the woman on the left looked like her mother, and the woman on the right looked like a friend of hers who always carried her handbag. I saw the waste paper thing, and I was about to walk by, but then I thought, gee, you can't pass that one up. It was just too good to pass up. I felt a little bit self-conscious about that picture. I've saved it for at least 35 years before I ever used it, because I really don't want to offend anybody when I take pictures like that. So after 35 years, or maybe even 40, we finally got to use it, and now I feel somehow nobody has the right to complain. I'm glad they haven't thrown it into the wastebasket yet, because I noticed that the two magazines are actually quite different from each other. I have not thought of that in the past. Which one would you read first? How can you read The Watchtower if you're not awake? How can you reach the Watchtower and be awake at the same time? Not easily done. So some things emerge as you look at a picture longer than you thought you'd ever would. It's still there, so we can still look at it. Waste paper bins look very much more modern now, and I like the old ones as much as the new ones. Anybody want to ask a question?
Anybody?
Sorry?
Okay, yeah, sure. No, that's great.
Is there somebody?
Yeah, over there.
Yes.
You'll have to shout it out because Fred's recovering from a cold and a flu, and he's been
Oh,
congested.
okay.
It's one of the reasons why he has had trouble hearing. But I can tell you that Sheila Rogers is on tape, and many of the presenters have written their comments, so you can.
And
go
what
back.
about Andy's comment?
Yeah, I think we'll have
I
those.
think you have
They're,
those
they're all
on tape.
prepared. Well, I don't know about tape, but I know that they're written. But we have a question. Could you shout it out?
I wanted to know what the first camera was that he ever used and what his favorite camera was that he ever used.
I didn't hear
First
that.
camera. What was the first camera that you ever used, and your favorite camera?
Yeah.
Well, no. I'll tell you quickly which cameras I had. I had my camera that I bought in Germany was a Kodak Retina 1, which didn't have a rangefinder, and it had a slow lens, but it took okay pictures for me. And And then I had one or two other cameras. One of them I dropped, and the other one I didn't keep because it malfunctioned. And then I bought a Leica M3 camera, and that was the fanciest camera of the day. The most famous photographers on earth used Leica M3. It had one advantage over other cameras. It was very quiet. When the shutter went off, you barely heard it. But it was not a reliable camera, and it was not even good when I bought it. The shutter didn't work when I unpacked it, and either way, the camera had to be fixed. And once a camera like that, which is precision assembled in a factory by very trained mechanics, once that camera has been fixed, it's never like new. That camera gave me nothing but trouble. One thing after the other broke down. So when people say you had a Leica, oh, that explains why I have all these good pictures. If I had a camera like that, I could take at least pictures that good or better. And so there, another question.
How do you find the new digital cameras versus the old analog cameras?
The digital cameras, they are made by a schizophrenic manufacturer. And here's what it is: they are too attractive not to use, but they don't do what you want to do. When you take it in your hand, right away your thumb releases all kinds of programs which you absolutely cannot do. And so you take a picture and nothing happens. And then you put the camera away in your pocket. And the self-release is right there where you absolutely do not want it, where you put your thumb. So I had to actually make a chip on the back of one of my cameras so I cannot accidentally press the self-release. And another thing I made is a leather thing for my thumb so I can't press down on things without me noticing it. So the cameras now are not made by photographers, they are made by geeks. And geeks don't take pictures. They design electronic instruments mostly to annoy us. And I'm just astonished how badly the cameras are designed. The picture quality leaves nothing to be desired. They're good, the pictures are good, and I've studied my first, I had a Lumix G1 and G2. I studied these and finally learned how to use them. Then came a new Lumix out, and it has a completely different operating system, just as stupid as the first. and it uses different batteries. So I have already three batteries for the first camera. I had to buy 3 more for the second camera because on an average day I need 3 batteries. So there's a great deal of progress possible in future if we live long enough. If the planet is occupied by us for long enough. Thank you.
We'll take another question.
Yes?
There was one right here.
Thank you for these beautiful photos. Will we also see work of the later decades, of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on?
Are you showing your work from the later decades of the 70s, 80s, and 90s? Will you be showing photographs that you've taken in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s?
I have not yet used those because we have kind of an image now of early color photography. I'm a pioneer, that's what I'm called now. And those pictures are the most important pictures I've taken simply because nobody else had the same good idea. And we haven't quite scraped the bottom of the barrel yet. As long as I have these old color pictures made on Kodachrome, which had an O speed of 10. Can you imagine that? 10, ISO 10. You can only take pictures on a very clear, sunny day. But I shot pictures with it on a rainy night, and that worked too. You just had to hold the camera very steady. A tripod would have helped, but I was too proud to use a tripod. Also didn't be bothered. Well, if you have the
Okay,
time.
final question here.
I was just wondering how much you're out on the street taking pictures every day, every second day?
Again, I did hear.
How often are you out on the street taking photographs? Are you out on the street every day? Or?
Oh no, I don't have the time. My life is because it's gotten with a certain amount of fame, I call it. I'm now a public property, and that gives me very little time to go out and take pictures in the street. But I also find the street a little bit. I'm just not young enough to look threatening, so people quite often stop me or want something from me, or I feel a bit unsafe actually in some parts of town, and some people don't want to have anything to do with the camera. A woman came up to me and smashed my camera.
Well, I think, Fred, we have a reception afterwards, and Fred, you'll be sticking around for the reception.
Yes.
Great. The great thing about going to visit Fred is I remember going over for a coffee for half an hour, and a few hours later I emerged. He's a great storyteller, he's a great humanitarian, he's a great artist, and we're lucky to have him with us. And big round of applause for Fred.
You can never step in the same river twice, observed Heraclitus. And Fred, you can never walk the streets of the same city twice. But thank you for capturing the reflection of this strange yet intimate city.